Hello friends, hope you are doing well. I am Dr. Gurmanpreet Kaur, Associate Professor of Law at Rajiv Gandhi National University of Law, Punjab. Today, we will discuss the topic of Rule of Absolute Liability. In the previous lecture, we have discussed the concept of strict liability. In this session today, we will discuss how strict liability has transformed into absolute liability. Introduction. To understand the concept of absolute liability, let's first briefly discuss strict liability and then we will proceed further. The law needs to be adaptable and evolve in accordance with requirements of the contemporary world. As the world is evolving or developing in terms of technology, economic activities, behavior, culture, and all other aspects, it will not be appropriate to apply centuries-old principles and laws to current cases and incidents. In general, a person's culpability in tort is a result of their negligence. Therefore, if a person can demonstrate that they were not negligent in their actions, they cannot be held accountable. To put it another way, if he can prove that he acted with caution when he committed the act that caused damage to the plaintiff, he may be able to avoid being held liable. However, this general principle of liability does not apply to cases that fall under the category of hazardous activities. In those cases, a person is always held liable for all the consequences of such acts, regardless of whether or not they were negligent. This is known as strict liability, which is a deviation from the usual notion of liability for fault in tort law. Justice Blackburn established the theory of strict liability for hazardous and inherently dangerous actions for the first time in the case of Rylands versus Fletcher's, which was determined in the year 1868. So for this reason, it is often referred to as Rylands versus Fletcher's rule. Let's now understand the facts of the case. The defendant was an owner of a mill in Ainsworth. He wanted to improve water supply for his mill. Therefore, he employed the services of independent, competent engineers to construct a reservoir. In the course of excavation work, they noticed some old shafts and passages to the defendant's land, but did not block them. When the water was filled in the reservoir, it ran through the porous shafts and flooded the plaintiff's coal mines on the adjoining land. The defendant did not know about the shafts, nor was he told about them by the qualified engineers who constructed the reservoir. When the plaintiff sued the defendant for damages, the court found that the defendant was not negligent, although the independent contractors were found to be negligent. But still, the court held the defendant liable on the principle propounded by the Court of Exchequer Chamber as follows. The person who for his own purposes brings on his land and collects and keeps there anything likely to do mischief, if it escapes, must keep it in at his own peril, and if he does not do so, is prima facie answerable for all the damage that is natural consequence of its escape. The fundamental principle of the rule is that an individual who introduces, retains, or accumulates any item on their property that is prone to escape, and if such an item does escape, inflicts harm on others, must do so at their own risk and must be accountable for all ensuing repercussions of the escape. These hazardous elements may encompass fire, petrol vapors, noise, smoke, petrol, electric current, explosives, perilous animals, water, etc. No degree of caution on his part will absolve him from culpability if his actions fall under the Ryland versus Fletcher rule. Liability can occur irrespective of the defendant's fault or negligence. So this rule is referred to as principle of strict liability. Moving further, friends, now let's discuss the elements of strict liability principle. It has been observed by the House of Lords that the rule is applicable when there is non-natural use of the land, from which the thing has escaped and has caused damage. Thus, it lays down the essentials of the rule as follows. First, there must have been non-natural use of land. Second, there must be an escape of the thing kept or brought there. And third, it must have caused mischief. Let's now discuss these principles in detail. Non-natural use of land. In a tort law suit, the plaintiff consistently seeks to demonstrate that their case falls under the strict responsibility doctrine. The rationale is that in this scenario, he is not required to demonstrate the defendant's negligence, and the burden of proof transfers to the defendant to establish that his case does not fit under the rule's scope. To succeed in his endeavor, the plaintiff must demonstrate all three key elements of the strict responsibility rule. The differentiation between natural and non-natural uses can be adapted to prevailing societal situations. For example, igniting a fire in the kitchen for culinary purposes, utilizing a fireplace for home heating, and storing petrol in vehicle's tank are all considered natural uses. In the case of Noble versus Harrison, decided in the year 1926, a branch of a beech tree growing on the defendant's land was overhanging the highway, and in a fine weather, it suddenly broke and fell upon the plaintiff's vehicle, which was passing along the highway. The breaking of the branch was sudden and undiscoverable. Therefore, this was held to be the natural user, and the case was not covered under the Rylands versus Fletcher's rule. the defendant was held not liable. In another case of Mukesh Textile Mills versus H.R. Subramanya Shastri, decided in 1987, the defendant was the owner of a sugar factory adjacent to the plaintiff's land. The molasses stored by the defendant somehow escaped and caused serious damage to the plaintiff's crop. The defendant was held liable for negligence in ensuring that the stock of molasses does not cause harm to the neighbor's crop. The court treated it as a non-natural use on the part of the defendant. Now let's move further to the next point. Escape. This is another essential requirement for the applicability of Ryland versus Fletcher rule. It has to be proved that the thing causing the damage escaped from the defendant's control due to its non-natural use by him. This principle is illustrated by the House of Lords decision in Reed versus J. Lyons and Company Limited, decided in the year 1947. In this case, the plaintiff, a lady, was an employee in the defendant's ammunition factory. While she was on duty, a shell that was being manufactured there exploded and thereby seriously injuring her. There was no evidence of negligence on the part of the defendants. Dismissing the claim of the plaintiff, the House of Lords held that there being no escape of the thing outside the defendant's premises. The rule in Ryland versus Fletcher did not apply to this case. In the case of Ponting versus Noakes, decided in the year 1894, where the plaintiff and the defendants were adjoining occupiers of land, and the defendant had a yew tree growing on his land, the branches of which extended close up to the boundary but did not cross it. The plaintiff's horse craned its neck across the boundary and ate the leaves of the yew tree, which, being poisonous, caused the plaintiff's horse to die in consequence. The defendant was held not liable as the element of escape was missing in the case. In fact, the plaintiff's horse had trespassed by craning his neck across the boundary into the plaintiff's land. Moving further now, let's discuss the third element, mischief, in the strict liability rule. The plaintiff must additionally demonstrate that, in addition to the defendant being a non-natural user and the thing escaping, the defendant's actions caused him harm in order to pursue his case under the strict responsibility rule. In other words, the plaintiff must demonstrate that the harm was caused by a non-natural user and that the item escaped from the defendant's property or premises in order to prove the resulting damage. Let's now discuss the exceptions to the rule of strict liability in torts. The concept of strict liability in torts has certain exceptions that the defendant can plead to escape from the liability. Following are the exceptions. Firstly, the default of the claimant in circumstances where the plaintiff suffers loss as a result of their own actions. The theory of strict liability would not be applied. In the case of Ponting versus Noakes, the plaintiff's horse died after eating leaves from the poisonous tree that was on the defendant's property. It was determined that plaintiff was to be blamed because the tree had not reached the plaintiff's property. The damage was caused due to natural use. If the defendant is able to demonstrate that the use of his property or land was natural, then the strict liability rule will not apply to his case. Instead, the case will be handled according to the general concept of liability for fault, which is carelessness. Secondly, act of God. The concept of strict responsibility in torts would not apply to circumstances in which damage is inflicted by actions that are irresistible and beyond human contemplation, or by the operation of a higher force that is beyond human control. Thirdly, consent of the claimant. If the plaintiff, who is the person making the claim, has either explicitly or implicitly agreed to the presence of a source of danger and the defendant has not acted negligently, then the defendant will not be held responsible. This exception simply resonates the concept of volenti non fit injuria. Fourthly, statutory authority. If an act is carried out with the permission of law or statute, such an action taken by a government agency, that action cannot be considered strictly liable. In the case of Green versus Chelsea Water Parks Company, 1874, the defendant's company was hired to maintain a continuous water supply under statutory authority. Court ruled that the bursting of the water supply was not the responsibility of the defendant and that the statutory protection would be granted. Next is act of third party. In tort cases, if damage is caused by the fault of a stranger or a third party, a defendant can claim a defense against strict liability. The defendant does not have control over such an act. In the case of Rickards versus LoT1, 1913, some strangers obstructed the water pipeline, which is generally within the control of the defendant. The blockage caused an explosion, which ultimately resulted in injury to the plaintiff. The defendant cannot be held responsible since the actions of the third party, which the defendant did not control, were the cause of the accident. Lastly, a common benefit of the plaintiff and the defendant. Strict responsibility in torts would not apply in situations where the source of hazard is kept for the common benefit of both plaintiff and the defendant. In the case of Box versus Job, 1879, the defendant's reservoir overflowed due to combination of plaintiff's reservoir and the defendant's own actions. The defendant cannot be held responsible because such reservoirs were put in place for the mutual advantage of both the parties. Dear friends, now let's understand the transformation of the strict liability rule into absolute liability. The concept of absolute culpability has also changed as a result of the significant changes in the way people live around the world, which have been brought about by advancements in science and technology. The economic activity and industrialization of today are very different from what they were in the past. In the present millennium of advanced industrial society, the rule of strict liability seems to have lost its qualifications in resolving the dispute and claims of the parties. In the year 1987, the Supreme Court of India voiced worry about the weakening effect of the strict liability rule in the case of MC Mehta versus Union of India. The court highlighted that the rule needed to be modified in order to make it more effective and relevant to the demands of the movement. In this decision, the court established a new theory known as absolute liability. The details of the case are as follows. Oleum gas leak from the Shri Ram Food and Fertilizer Industries unit in Delhi. It resulted in deaths of an advocate and several other individuals. MC Mehta submitted a writ petition to the Supreme Court of India under Article 32 of the Constitution through public interest litigation. He requested that Shri Ram Industries be shut down in the appeal, since it is located in a densely populated region of Delhi and is involved in production of dangerous materials. While the petition was still being considered, oleum gas split from one of its units, affecting persons at mass. a 3-judge panel permitted a partial reopening of the facility but ordered the business to implement all essential safety precautions to protect individuals who were impacted by the gas leak. Delhi Legal Aid and Advice Court and the Delhi Bar Association submitted a request for the compensation in the initial suit filed by MC Mehta. The absolute liability rule was laid down as follows. First, the modified version of the strict liability rule should change this liability into absolute liability. The rule in this case should be that if an industry or business that is involved in an activity that is inherently dangerous causes harm or damage to someone while it is operating, it should be held absolutely liable to compensate the affected parties. And this liability should be without any exceptions. Secondly, the impact of the change in the Ryland versus Fletcher rule will be that if a business is permitted to engage in an activity that appears to be dangerous or hazardous by a statute, the presumption of law will be that the business or undertaking will be completely responsible for the potential consequences and damages that result from it. In addition, it should be a requirement for these industries to offer sufficient safety measures in order to prevent any potential accidents or hazards that may arise from their operations. The Supreme Court also ruled that a business that operates in a hazardous or inherently dangerous industry, which poses a potential threat to the health and safety of the people who work in the factory and live in the surrounding areas, has an absolute and non-delegible duty to the community to ensure that no harm comes to anyone as a result of hazardous or inherently dangerous activities it has undertaken. The company must be required to carry out the hazardous or intrinsically risky activity in accordance with the highest safety requirements. As a result, if any injury occurs as a result of this conduct, the company must be completely responsible for compensating for such harm, even if it took reasonable precautions and the harm occurred without any negligence on its behalf. The court further stated that the amount of compensation that must be paid should be proportionate to the total revenue and capacity of the business so that the same can have the desired deterrent impact. The larger and more successful a business is, the more compensation it must pay for any damage caused by an accident that occurs while it is carrying out a hazardous or intrinsically risky activity. In the matter of Union Carbide Corporation versus Union of India, 1988, also referred to as Bhopal Gas Tragedy Case, on the night of December 2nd to 3rd, 1984, a gas leak occurred at the Union Carbide India Limited plant, which was established for pesticide production in Bhopal. Approximately 4,000 individuals perished and over 2 lakh sustained injuries due to this extraordinary circumstance. The Union Carbide Association provided remuneration to the victims. In the case of Indian Council for Environmental Legal Action versus Union of India, environmental pollution occurred in Bitch village and neighboring areas due to manufacturing of H-acid and effluents from the sulfuric acid plant. A writ petition was submitted to the Supreme Court under Article 32 of the Constitution as social action litigation on behalf of communities impacted by pollution, infringing upon their right to life as guaranteed by Article 21 of the Constitution. The Supreme Court determined that the writ petition was permissible as the court possessed the authority and obligation to act and safeguard citizens' right to life. The Supreme Court in this instance endorsed the principle established in MC Mehta case, asserting that when an activity is hazardous or intrinsically dangerous, the individual conducting such activity is obligated to adhere to regulations concerning the requisite standard of reasonable care during its execution. The enterprise alone has the authority and resources to devise and implement precautions against such hazards and dangers. Consequently, the respondent in this instance was deemed unequivocally accountable to indemnify the villagers for the damages incurred. The factories, plants, machinery, and all other immovable assets of the respondent enterprises were ordered to be attached, and the amount that was determined was recovered. The Ministry of Environment and Forest, Government of India, used the recovered sum to carry out all the necessary actions to restore the soil, water sources, and environment in general of the afflicted area to its previous condition. The respondent industries, which had been labelled as rogue industries, were ordered to shut down because of their ongoing, unrelenting, and brazen violations of the law. These industries had caused immeasurable suffering to the unsuspecting villagers by ruining their land, their resources, and their entire environment. The ruling also mandated that the respondent industries pay the petitioner a sum of Rs 50,000 in expenses. The petitioner had to battle this action for 6 years using its own resources. Conclusion. To conclude, the absolute liability rule has a significantly broader scope in all respects when compared to all of the previous regulations. Industrial progress and quality of life for humans must be balanced. The creation of businesses in densely populated regions poses a threat to the lives of the people who live there. The court created the idea of absolute liability in order to prevent such incidents similar to Bhopal gas tragedy and the Shri Ram case from happening again. The rule of strict liability is no longer relevant and cannot be applied to the current scenario, in which industrial expansion is essential for economic progress. The Supreme Court's introduction of the progressive and forward-thinking premise in MC Mehta versus Union of India case is exactly what India needs right now. The evolution of absolute liability has resulted in improved justice and decision making because of its application and scientific approach. So with this, we come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you very much.